go. These talks are being recorded. You can find them at the page where you registered, or you can find them at our landing page online. So that is where you can get to these. All right. Okay, so it is March 9th, 2022. It's already early March. It's almost already mid-March. It's bonkers. And today we're going to be talking about Minnesota's bees, planting for pollinators, and the Prairie Pod, a podcast of well-renowned and famed repute. Our guests today are from the southern region here in the state. Megan Benage. Megan, help me out.
Benage, like a cabbage.
Benage, Megan Benage. Nicole Gerjets, Jess Petersen, and myself. I'm James Burnham. Nicole and Jess are with the Minnesota Biological Survey. Nicole is our bee survey extraordinaire, and Jess is our invertebrate ecologist. Knowledge haver. My words are just failing. It is Wednesday. It is it's so bright outside. Anyway, my name is James Burnham. I am the Recruitment, Retention, Reactivation Coordinator for the state of Minnesota. And this is the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. This is a weekly series, so we've been doing this every week. We're coming up on our year mark here at the end of the month. Woohoo! And it's all about a chance for folks to tune in, learn new stuff, find out information about a variety of topics. The real kicker is that it gives you a chance, you, the audience, a chance to interact and ask DNR staff and guests real-time questions. So if there's something that's like burning a hole in your frontal lobe of your brain, you can be like, how does this work? And we'll answer it. It's amazing. It's always Wednesdays at noon, and it usually takes up the whole noon hour when we get through the questions. And really, our goal is for everybody that's tuning in to learn about hunting, fishing, and outdoor recreation opportunities we have here across Minnesota, to share how we manage the state's wildlands and wildlife, and to give tips on how you can be stewards for our shared natural resources. Our upcoming webinars, next week we have a fantastic talk on rifle cartridge selection. So if you have been staying awake at night wondering, should I get the 243? Should I get the 30-30? Should I get the 30-06? That's the talk you want to go to, because they're going to answer your talk. Craig Heiger, our shooting sports coordinator and Northwoods guru, he is going to be going into a deep dive on rifle cartridges and which ones are appropriate for which hunting applications. March 23rd, I'm going to be talking with my good buddy Aaron from the Minnesota Steelhead Association about steelhead fishing on Minnesota's North Shore. It's a springtime ritual that is just really, really cool, and I think it's going to be a really, really great topic. March 30th, we're going to be talking about fishing for rough fish, and then on April 4th, we're going to be talking about attracting sharp-tailed grouse to your property and how to manage for those resources. So a variety of topics. You know, we've got some shooting in there, we've got some fishing, we've got some property management, plus birds. Who doesn't like birds? It should be a good opportunity. So that's what's coming up. But today we are going to be talking about Minnesota's pollinators, and what the Minnesota DNR is doing about them, as well as hear from some amazing folks, Megan, Jess, and Nicole, on the work that's being done. And I'm going to turn it over to them. They're going to kind of give their own introductions. And Megan, I'm going to drag the presenter role to you, and you can get going. And remember, Megan, you're muted, so we can unmute and hit the ground. So take it away, Megan.
Don't you worry. After 2 years of only online meetings, I know about this old mute button.
You know, I like to think that about myself, but yet I find it's always new. It's always like, oh yeah, I'm still muted. So, all right, take it away. Thanks, Megan.
Okay, I'm just working on sharing my screen here, and hopefully I share the right one so that you guys are seeing my PowerPoint.
Discover the prairie.
There it is. Great.
Nice,
Okay, perfect.
nice hashtag.
We're gonna jump right in, and I'm starting my timer because I tend to be a long talker. I wish I could say that this is a pandemic effect of not being around people, but this is just me on the regular. So welcome, I'm Megan Benage. You say it like a cabbage. I am a regional ecologist down here in southern Minnesota, and I'm going to walk you through discovering some of our prairie landscapes today, which I think are just absolutely fantastic and incredible. This is me kneeling in one of the rarest wetlands in the world, a calcareous fen. Fancy word, it's a groundwater fed ecosystem, super amazing, and they occur in this prairie landscape. So you can see on your screen there that little pale background in southern southwest Minnesota. That is my area. So I cover 32 counties in southern Minnesota. And I get this question a lot, usually from kids who are saying, well, what is an ecologist? What do you do? It's always hard for me to summarize succinctly, so I'll do my best. Basically, an ecologist is looking at the parts and pieces of an ecosystem and how those parts and pieces interact with their environment. But as a DNR ecologist, then I'm taking that a step further and trying to figure out, is our landscape in balance? Do we have enough prairie so that we can have a livable climate, so that we can thrive and survive here in southern Minnesota? How do we get into balance, and what are some ways where we can find blended benefits across the landscape that will be good for all of us? So it's a fun challenge, it's a super fun job, and I'm really excited to get to share with you my first love, the prairie. So we're gonna start out. It's a little depressing initially, but then we're gonna bring you back up at the end. So the Minnesota prairie, we used to have 18 million acres in Minnesota. So everything on that map that is colored in yellow, or the larger blobs on the map, that is the prairie that we used to have. It covered about 1/3 of the state. Today we have right around 150,000 acres. So we're at less than 2% of prairie in the state of Minnesota. So that's a pretty huge loss. And with that provides challenges, but it also provides lots of opportunities for us to figure out how to connect this landscape so that we can have, again, enough prairie to survive and thrive in all of these prairie spaces and places. So prairies are super unique in that they are dominated by grass, but they also have a wildflower component. They rely on disturbance for survival. What does that mean? It means that they need to have periodic fire or grazing or changes in climate. They're adapted to these things. They've evolved through time to be able to handle it. And so now, as we look at the landscape, obviously in lots of places, we don't have free ranging bison, right? And we're in a wildland fire suppression mode. So we don't often have wildland fire that is moving across the prairie and touching thousands and thousands of acres. And so that provides a unique challenge to managers where we have to figure out how to reintroduce some of those disturbances back. And it's all about timing, frequency, and intensity. And of course, there's climatic variability that we just simply can't always predict. And so every patch of prairie should not necessarily be treated the same. We have opportunities to try to make some good choices and then to try to learn from those too. We're constantly learning. These are complex systems, they're old systems, and we're trying to figure it all out. One thing that we know is very true as we think about how we figure all of this out is that diversity matters. So, in case nobody's ever said this to you, I'm going to say it to you right now. Diversity is the #1 indicator of health in any system, whether we're talking about your human body as a system or we're talking about the landscape. Diversity is the #1 indicator of health. So what I mean by that is having a variety of plant species or a variety of species in general in one place. This, in terms of like a prairie planting, is key to a planting success. So the more diverse a planting is, the better chance it has at long-term health and self-sustainability, which can translate to lower management costs and other benefits like that. Because if you think about it, there's going to be change. This is one of the hardest things for us as people to adapt to, right? But the prairie knows how to deal with change. It was literally built to do it. Last year, we had a drought across much of Minnesota. And if you looked at the prairie, what we saw is different species dominated during that drought. I saw side oats grama, which is a tiny prairie grass that was like maybe yay high, right? And it was just dominating. It didn't mean the other plants were gone. It just meant that we had a new star on the prairie at that given time. And if you have diversity, you can have a species come in and be more dominant and fill a role that another species might have played in a wetter climate year. And so that's why it's super duper important, because we got to be able to respond to these extremes. So other things about diversity, you get increased water infiltration, you get soil health benefits, you get resistance to plant invasion. We already talked a little bit about drought tolerance, and then you can mitigate climate change. All good things that the prairie can do. So we often talk about old growth forests and how neat they are and how beneficial they are. And that's something we can see, right? We can visually see this is a really big tree. I wonder how long it's been here. But we kind of forget that with prairies, we can have old growth prairies too. It's just that the dynamics of that system are different. So just like an old growth forest, a really healthy functioning prairie consists of thousands, yes, I said thousands of different organisms, whether that's plants, animals, invertebrates, bacteria, soil fungi, or fungi if you're Italian. All of those organisms rely on these complex interactions of nutrients, moisture, and energy flow so that they can create and provide them with food, water, and shelter, which are all the things that we all need to survive. Unlike a forest, the individual abundances of these species, whether it's prairie plants or animal species, those abundances change frequently in response to disturbance, such as fire, grazing, and climate extremes. So what that gives you is in any given year, a particular patch of prairie can look very different from year to year. And that's not necessarily bad. It's something that we as people just need to be ready to adapt and change to and accept. And I get it. When I look at a prairie, there's certain things I want to see there. I have my favorites. We all do, right? But part of being a prairie ecologist is learning to expand my favorites portfolio and appreciate species that I might not otherwise have had appreciation for, because we need to allow this landscape to shift as a mosaic of change, because that's what a prairie is. Probably not surprising when you look at this picture, right, of these fabulous prairie roots. Infinitely more fascinating than what's happening above ground is what's happening below grounds. So prairies have these vast underground ecosystems. And think about it like this. There are more microbes in a teaspoon of healthy soil than there are people on Earth. In case you're like instantly Googling how many people are on Earth, it's around 7 billion. So our prairies have literally tons of bacteria and fungi with unique relationships with each other. And so when we talk about, prairies being able to mitigate climate change, of course they do. Look at that biomass. Look at that root system. It's a phenomenal amount of roots. It's arguably somewhere around 60 to 70% more below ground than what you see as the physical representation of the plant above ground. So if you're thinking of a big blue stem or a plant that's like 6 feet tall, multiply that by 3, and that is getting you at what's happening below ground. You have 18 feet or greater below ground, which is just phenomenal when you think of all of the things that that root system can do and how alive and complex that community is. So we're going to pivot a little bit to some things that you can do, because we're in this state. You heard earlier when I said we have this huge loss of prairie, right? But with that, there's this opportunity, and we're in this phase where even small plantings can make a difference. And so whether you're thinking about how can I get some prairie plants into my home landscaping, or you're like, man, I'm gonna go buy 10,000 acres and restore it to prairie. Both are valid. Both are great. Arguably, one might have a bigger impact on moving the needle for conservation for prairie, but both of these things are super duper important. And so I just love this picture right here of Isaac. He is helping weed a prairie, and so he's just getting involved. If you don't have land, and or if you're somebody who's like, I don't plant things, I don't want to, that's okay. You could also volunteer. You could sponsor a youth group like this to go out and help clean up a prairie. We have lots of volunteer options on the DNR's website. There's lots of ways to share a prairie passion with other folks. So if you are thinking about how do I approach prairie restoration, or how do I get some more prairie into my landscaping, these are the general things that you need to be thinking about. So what do you want it to look like? This is arguably the most important question, because if you go into this and you're thinking to yourself, I just want it to be real pretty. I mean, that's great, but what does that mean? Pretty to you could be different than pretty to me, right? And so we need to think about, do you want lots of flowers? What's your timeline for getting this to happen? And what are you dealing with? What's going on at your site? Is it compacted ground? Because we're going to have to figure out a way to loosen that ground up so that way we can get prairie plants planted into them. Are you on a steep hill slope? What's the past vegetation? Do you have invasive species on site? How are you going to introduce disturbance into the planting? And please understand, I'm not suggesting that you turn your front yard into a prairie and then throw a match out there. Like, that's not what we want you to do. But you should have a plan, because they're a disturbance-based habitat, for if you change that landscape into a prairie, how will you manage it? Could you mimic haying, for example? Will you get a small goat? There's lots of different options. Myself, in my yard, I have a very tiny yard, and I have converted almost all of it to a prairie planting. I definitely have, I'm using haying as my model for that. So, and then budget. Prairie seed can be quite expensive, and there's lots of different reasons for why it's expensive, but one of the biggest reasons is because it's rare. When you have less than 2% of something left, it is rare, and we can't ask the remainder to do everything that this huge connected complex historically did. And so we have to be, we have to keep that in mind. The cost of losing this habitat does translate when we try to put it back. So a couple other things to keep in mind. What's your soil moisture on site? Do you have really dry, sandy soils? Are you somewhere in the middle? Is it mesic? Do you have poorly drained, very poorly drained? There are options for any of these. I'm not sure that people necessarily want a wet prairie in their yard, but if that is your soil situation, there are choices. And so I like this chart that we've kind of provided for you here, because it matches your soil drainage class with the type of seed mix that you should be designing. So like if you have excessively drained soil, you want a dry seed mix, versus if you have a very poorly drained soil, you would want a wet seed mix. It's also super important to make sure that you're selecting plants from different functional groups. And I know, what is she talking about? What's a functional group? So these are plants that have different roles in the prairie, and we kind of group them together to make it a little bit easier to do restoration. So you can kind of have some check boxes, right? I love a good checkbox list. So you want to make sure you have cool season grasses, warm season grasses, sedges and rushes, legumes, non-legume forbs. And then you could consider some perennial shrubs, or even some trees as like a boulevard planting. I'm not suggesting that you necessarily put those in the middle of your prairie, but they do provide pollinators with some early blooming, I was like early blooming stuff, early blooming flowers that they can then feed on. So these are just all different things that you want to make sure that you consider. If one of these functional guilds isn't filled, I guarantee you nature will fill it for you, and it will fill it for you with something that you do not want. So these are the things that make a planting healthy, functional, and able to survive and thrive. That's like my word of the day, survive and thrive. See how many times we can use it. If you're thinking about just a prairie that's aesthetically pleasing, but also a prairie that's really providing habitat for pollinators, you have to be providing flowers throughout the season. So we're talking all the way from early spring into late fall, September, October-ish. And it's really tough to try to find plants in that early bloom category. We have plants that certainly occur in that. It's just that their availability in seed markets and as plugs can be somewhat challenging, because they often tend to be plants that are hard to harvest seed from or a little bit more expensive. But that doesn't mean you can't do it. There are ways to make these things happen. Where there's a will, there's a way. So if you have this diversity of blooms, it means that you're providing food for all different kinds of pollinators throughout the season because they all have different needs and life cycles. And Nicole and Jess are going to tell you all about that. Flowers in spring are super duper important for bumblebees, and especially spring and fall, I guess I should say, because bumblebees are out the majority of the season. They're some of the first bee species to emerge in the spring, and so you really want to make sure you've got food for them because they are hungry when they are coming out. And then you also want to think about species from different plant families. Just like my family is different from Jess's family, is different from James's family, is different from Nicole's family, that diversity, bringing that diversity together is a great thing when you're talking about a prairie. So because again, all of these different pollinator species have different needs. So you want to be thinking about, in particular, asters, some of the legumes, willows are a really good early blooming nectar source for different kinds of pollinators. And then even some of our native loosestrifes. I know loosestrifes have kind of gotten a bad rap throughout the years because folks we associate it with purple loosestrife and we're like, loosestrife, bad. But there's lots of native loosestrifes, and there's even loosestrifes that can exist in a more mesic soil, and they're really pretty. I just added some to my prairie garden here. So this helps just make sure too that you have visual interest. So you have lots of different flower shapes, colors, bloom times, and nutritional value. And then it provides you with different things to look at, which is handy. So a couple quick slides on some important bee plants as you're thinking about these things. So I didn't include pictures of these, and I'm regretting that. I should have, because pictures for sure would have been way better than this chart. So next time I'll do better. That's all we can do is promise to do better. So Golden Alexander's is a yellow flower. It's very nice. Native yarrow is white and it's short. You can get a cultivar yarrow that is taller than a Megan, and that's not what we want because most of our pollinator species, well, I shouldn't say most, our pollinator species evolved with native plants. And so they're adapted to those specific variety of plants, including their bloom timing, including their size of flower parts versus size of bee proboscis. So those are all things that we want to make sure we're getting the native variety. Fall sunflower, just like it sounds, it looks like a sunflower, but it's not. So, and then black-eyed Susan, anise hyssop, smells like licorice and has these great purple spikes on it. Purple prairie clover, one of my favorites. It's a tiny purple flower, and when you crush the leaves, it smells like oranges and pine trees, which is great. And then wild bergamot is a favorite, has a purple flower that looks like a jester's hat. Gray-headed coneflower is a pretty yellow flower, and then stiff goldenrod is another yellow flower. And then I put lead plant over here on the side because where this chart came from is Harmon, Threat, and Hendricks in 2015 did an assessment of different prairie restorations, and they were basically trying to see if some plants were more beneficial to native bees than others. And these 4 species, Golden Alexander's, purple prairie clover, gray-headed coneflower, and lead plant, all came out as bee favorites and that they had more bee visitors. And then Ian Lane did a similar study. He's with the University of Minnesota, and he had those same species pop out, all except for lead plant, and that was because they didn't find very much lead plant in the restorations that he was evaluating. But in addition to those 3, the Golden Alexander's, purple prairie clover, and gray-headed coneflower, these other ones too also had the most number of bee visitors. So they seem to be pretty important. Early blooming plants, I already said it once, I'll say it again. It's super important. So when you think about things like Canada thistle or other invasives that might be less desirable, most of the time what has happened in that planting, what happened is that planting did not include early season plants. And so when that niche or that guild, that functional group is missing, again, something else takes its place. So I would highly, highly recommend that you include some of these early blooming species so that way your planting is diverse and it's resilient and it can withstand that invasion a little bit better. Oh dear, it's doing a thing. There we go. So I did include pictures. I told you I'd do better and it already happened. Way to promise and then deliver. I'm so proud of myself in this moment. So just a few more prairie friends for you to plant. I went ahead and circled the ones that were in the list that I talked about earlier. Oops, I went too fast. Sorry about that. So there's that lead plant and the hyssop and the goldenrod, golden Alexanders, all of those plants. And in addition, we don't necessarily always think about this when we're thinking about providing pollinator friendly plants, but grasses are a super important component. These are their nest and rest sites. In some cases, for different pollinators, they're the food that their larvae eats. And so I won't get into that too much because, again, Jess and Nicole are going to walk you right through that. And Jess and Nicole, I have one more slide and then I'm done. So these are all plants that I would highly recommend, particularly pastflower for those early emerging queen bumblebees. Sometimes you'll just see them nestled right in the flower as they're trying to get that nectar because they're so tired and they're starving. So a couple take-home messages for things that you can do. These are ways that you can help the prairie. So you want to plant regionally native wildflowers, grasses, and sedges. It's really important that they're native to Minnesota and they're native to your area. As much as you can, try to avoid using pesticides, provide nesting habitat. That could be in the form of open ground or some of those different grasses that we just showed on the last side. You can check out the DNR's volunteering webpage for ways to get involved. There are lots of ways that you can participate and adopt a prairie. And it's not just about DNR. We're in a prairie partnership with so many other organizations. So you can also check out ways to volunteer through the Prairie Enthusiast Group. You can check out the Nature Conservancy's website, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited. The list goes on and on and on. So those are all things you can do. And just a reminder that every choice you make matters. So even if you're like, I don't want to volunteer and these plants are pretty, but I'm tired and I can't plant them. Even when you go to the store and you purchase different things, you can be supporting prairie in with your dollars and cents. And so then lastly, you want to talk to people about this. Talk to people you saw talk about prairie. You had no idea that it was giving you clean air, drinkable water, mitigating climate change, providing healthy soils. And now and plus it's awesome. You had no idea. Now you want to share this with other people. You knew trees did it, but you didn't know that prairie did it. So finally, I just leave you with this philosophical thought, you know, all of the land and all of the work that we're doing collectively at the DNR, as an ecologist, I look to the land and it's telling me a story. And I want to be part of that story. I want to help the prairie persist because I love it. I'm excited about it. I'm passionate about it. I think it's amazing. And so the question I leave you with is, how will you be part of it? And if you want to hear more from me and more about thinking about all these prairie puzzlers, you can check us out on the Prairie Pod, where our whole purpose of that podcast is to just talk through all of the challenges of trying to restore prairie in this landscape and also why prairie matters. And I'm going to turn it over to Jess and Nicole.
Fantastic, Megan. Thank you so much. I'm gonna make Nicole. You're gonna be driving the slideshow, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna get that down here.
I don't know how to stop
And
sharing my screen.
there have been a lot of questions coming in, and the ones that we can answer, we're answering, and then we're gonna, if we can't answer them at the moment, we're going to wait until the end, and we'll have Megan and Jess and Nicole answer questions. So I've also been posting some links in the chat, so keep an eye on that. It's kind of hard to click on links on the PowerPoints because they don't work over the WebEx, but we're trying to put in links as they come up in the chat. So keep an eye on there. And yeah, thank you so much. So Nicole, take it away.
Great. So you should be seeing my PowerPoint here.
Yep.
Wonderful. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and zoom in to those flowers that you see on the prairie. And I'm going to talk about pollination, why bees are important, and what the DNR has been doing about the bees and what we've learned so far. So my name's Nicole Gerjets. I'm the bee survey specialist for the Minnesota Biological Survey at the DNR. And my work primarily consists of leading and conducting bee surveys during the field season, and then specimen processing, identification, and databasing in the fall and the winter. And I work very closely with Jess Petersen, our invertebrate ecologist with the Minnesota Biological Survey. And she directs surveys for invertebrates, and primarily our focus has been on butterflies and bees lately. So who are pollinators? A pollinator moves pollen from one flower to another. So flies, wasps, moths, beetles, bees, ants, birds, butterflies, all these are examples of some pollinators. So any animal that visits a flower to drink the nectar or to eat the pollen will pick up pollen and move it around with them. But bees are the most effective pollinators because they visit flowers with the purpose of collecting pollen. Bees are the only pollinators that actively gather pollen from flowers, and it's these species that are the best pollinators. They have specialized branched hairs or other structures made to collect and hold the pollen. They're visiting flowers to collect pollen to provision for their young. Most bees are generalists, which means they will forage on any plant species and aren't restricted to one specific flower host. So bumblebees are a good example of this. Oftentimes you see them throughout the season, early in the spring and all the way late into the fall. Compared to bee specialists who will collect pollen from a few or just even one plant species. So they have a specialized relationship with that genus or species of plant, and they will emerge at the same time as their host plant does. So oftentimes these specialists are out for just a short period of time while that specific plant is out blooming. So pollen comes from the flower's anthers and is transferred to the stigma when the bee moves from flower to flower. The fertilized flower later yields fruit and seeds. Grass plants are mostly wind pollinated, whereas forbs are perhaps more likely to need animal-mediated pollination. As you can see, this honeybee has a special structure called a corbricula that holds a pollen ball. And as that bee moves from flower to flower, it transfers pollen. So most bees, about 60 to 70% of them, are ground nesters. So a single female that you can see here will dig a tunnel, and sometimes will have multiple chambers. Other female bees will find cut or naturally occurring open stems to start a nest in. So in both of these cases, the female will provision cells one by one, placing a pollen ball, laying an egg on it, and then closing that cell. As you can see here in the ground, there's the pollen ball with the egg that was laid on there, and each cell is divided, same as in the stem. So another type of nest that primarily is used by bumblebees are pre-existing cavities. So in the spring, a queen will come out of hibernation and will be in search of a nesting site. So they'll choose something like an abandoned rodent burrow or some rocks in a crack or other man-made cavities that you may have found some bumblebees around your property. They'll find a good suitable place and then they'll start making their colony there. So bees range in sociality. So highly social bees like honeybees have large colonies that cooperate to take care of young, with one queen and thousands of specialized workers. Bumblebees also have colonies, but they're just much smaller than compared to honeybees. High sociality allows colonies to grow large and quickly, but these close quarters can facilitate spread of disease and pests. So in contrast, solitary bees, which make up about 90% of the bees that we see, nest as individuals. So every adult female creates her own nest to lay in provision for her own young. All females can reproduce, and there are no workers like honeybee or bumblebee colonies. Often a large group of solitary bees will nest in aggregations. These are not colonies, but instead lots of individual nests that individual females will tend to. Some bees fall somewhere in between here. There are semi-social bees where many females from overlapping generations work together, or there's communal bees where females will share a nest entrance, but then they'll take care of their own brood. So often when a person thinks of a bee, their first thought is a honeybee. But that's only one species that is found here, and that species isn't native to the United States. Bees are very diverse. There are over 20,000 bee species worldwide. About 4,000 of those are native to the United States, and 490 of those are in Minnesota. So only 10% of those bees are social, like I mentioned, the bumblebees and honeybees, and the rest are solitary. The single female will tend to her own nest. Native bees come in a variety of colors and shapes and sizes, as you can see in the photos here. They can range from 2 millimeters to 39 millimeters, which is just over 1.5 inches. Some are very hairy, while others are nearly hairless. There are ground nesting bees like mining bees, cavity nesting bees like mason bees, and some bees like cuckoo bees, they don't make a nest at all. Instead, they sneak their eggs into another bee's nest. Some have pollen collecting hairs on their legs, like the longhorn bees, while others have it on their bellies, like the leafcutter bees. So certainly honeybees have seen dramatic declines. Our current thoughts about pollinator decline and pollinator crisis stem from studies on pollinators of economic value, like the honeybee. But does this mean there is a pollinator crisis? Despite concerns about global pollinator crisis, long-term data on the status of bee species is limited. We need comprehensive long-term pollinator data from biologically diverse and undisturbed communities to evaluate the actual extent of this pollinator crisis. So here's one example. In this paper, the authors show some bumblebees, like Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee, they're doing just great, while others are on the brink of extinction, like Bombus affinis, the rusty patch bumblebee, which is federally endangered. Declines in species richness were only documented or apparent in bumblebee species. But we need this baseline data to know whether or not bee abundance is increasing, decreasing, or stable. As I mentioned, there's a lot more species than just bumblebees. So keep in mind that this is a taxa we know a lot about. A lot of research has been done about bumblebees, and we still know a little about other taxa, even flies and beetles and ants. So now I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more and talk about the bees in Minnesota and what the DNR has been doing to learn more about them. So Minnesota's pollinators face challenges such as loss of floral resources, impacts of pesticides, climate change, diseases, and parasites. Some, including the rusty patch bumblebee that I mentioned, have been listed as federally endangered throughout its range, and that does include here in Minnesota. These declines suggest that many other pollinators are at risk, but we lack that data on most of these species. The Minnesota Biological Survey received funding from the Minnesota Environmental and Natural Resources Trust Fund to conduct a statewide bee survey. That survey started in 2015 with the goal to compile existing information and conduct surveys. So with these baseline data, we can begin to regularly monitor bees to assess trends in abundance and diversity through time. So what have we done? So we started by visiting collections and museums around the Midwest to document the species that were historically found here. We also started the statewide survey to document bees that we currently found throughout the state. So as of now, all counties in Minnesota have had some surveys done. We have collected specimens from a variety of native habitats, including off of wildlife management areas, scientific and natural areas, nature conservancy preserves, and state parks. You can see there's still some gaps, especially in the north central Minnesota, which we'll be focusing on in this coming field season. but we're really starting to wrap up this portion of the project. So why do we collect specimens? Some bee species can be identified using photographic evidence without the need to collect specimens, like bumblebees, but other species require viewing under a microscope by a trained expert. Specimens are a valuable tool for discovering new species, understanding genetics, environmental impacts, and how species vary across space and over time. Insect collections are important to be able to document biodiversity in the past and then offer a way to look into how that might be changing in the future. We carefully consider the impact of our collections and acknowledge the responsibility to learn the most we can from these actions. So all the bee specimens that we've collected, like the ones pictured here, are identified and deposited at the University of Minnesota Insect Collection, where they will be permanently curated and made available for other research, education, conservation, and whatever other resources or other uses that people might find interested in the future. So although our knowledge of bees is improving, there is still a whole lot more to learn. So one of the first steps towards understanding how to protect bees is knowing which species reside in Minnesota and then the distribution within the state. So this project, with collaboration from the University of Minnesota Bee Lab, we have established a state list of bee species of approximately 490 species. We have also expanded upon our understanding of the distributions of many bee species and contributed new species to the state list. We have documented about 5 new state records from this work at the Minnesota Biological Survey. So here we have a picture of 2 examples of the species where we have expanded county records. So the green shaded counties were the museum historic records, and then the darker shaded counties are records that we have collected from the Minnesota Biological Survey that's been done. So note, when you're looking at these maps, we just recently have started surveying in the Northeast, and so these haven't been updated with those data. But you can see that these species are found throughout the state, but the historical records were pretty spotty. So then what are we doing next? Jessica and I have been working with Zach Portman and Ian Lane at the University of Minnesota Bee Lab. The draft of a Bees of Minnesota publication is what we've been working on, and that's how we've gotten that list of bee species. So we're starting to shift also from the surveying that we've done, because we've already got that baseline data, and now we're going to start monitoring more. So we have a better understanding of the species found here, and some of the bee specialists or rare species or species of concern, we can target those and start doing some more monitoring focused on those species. We can use these baseline data to inform conservation efforts. And we have been able to provide the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service data about species like Bombus affinis or the rusty patch bumblebee or Bombus tricolor or Bombus pennsylvanicus, which are a few bumblebees that have been looked at for listing. So besides the survey work and the specimen work, we also do some education and outreach. So we'll be working with Xerces Society to host 3 identification and monitoring workshops. These will follow the Xerces protocol, identifying the groups of bees based on their morpho groups, which you can see pictured here. They are tentatively planned for this summer in northeastern Minnesota. And they're open to the public. We're targeting groups of like master naturalists or people who are interested in continuing to use these protocols and to monitor bees in their area. So I will end on the note of what you can do to help. So there are many ways to get involved and support pollinators. As today you've joined this webinar, that is one great way to get involved and learn more about the pollinators around you. There's lots of things you can do. You can plant a variety of native flowers and keep your garden blooming throughout the entire season, like Megan mentioned. There's all those bees that are specialists, so you can plant a variety of native plants. Leave natural undisturbed areas in your yard for nesting. You don't have to cover up everything. Most of our bees are ground nesting, so they'll need some bare soil to be able to make some nests. You can support taxonomists, natural history collections, and monitoring. Become a citizen scientist or a volunteer. And the most important one that I think is the next time you're just out in a natural area, you're out taking your dog for a walk or enjoying a nice, beautiful day, just stop and take a moment. Look at some flowers that are blooming around you. What critters do you see? Do you see some flies, bees, butterflies, spiders, moths? If you take a moment to look at the flowers, you might be surprised how many insects you might see on a single plant. And if this really interests you, you can use iNaturalist or Bumblebee Watch to document some of your findings, even just around your yard. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining us today. And if you have any questions about the work the DNR is doing with bees, this is Jessica and my information to contact us.
Nicole, that is fantastic. Thank you so much. The Q&A in the chat has just been busy. There's a bee joke in there somewhere. I'm not making it. But thank you so much. Before we get to it, I just want to say really quick, this webinar series, it's our sweet spot is hunting and fishing and that sort of skill set. But recognizing the pollinators that are out there, one of the most impressive things that I've seen was last spring of 2021. I was out turkey hunting, and it was down in the southeast, and there were a bunch of bluffs, and it was early season, so it was that opening week in April. April was warm, and we were hiking back. It was about a 4-mile hike back, and we were coming up some of the bluffs, and every 50 meters I was stopping because I was that out of shape. But I was like, every time I stopped, I was surrounded by tricolor bumblebees buzzing around looking for stuff. So it's just one of those things that I never would have seen that if I hadn't been out turkey hunting. But the same thing is, I didn't get a turkey that day, but I remember that trip because of those tricolored bumblebees. So this stuff, like I said, this webinar, our sweet spot is hunting and fishing, but these things are out there. They're amazing. They're fun to watch. They're fun to learn about. So let's get into the questions because there are a few. And I know Megan and Jess have been keeping track with stuff, and I've been trying to as well. A lot of these have been answered, but here's one from Bill. I have land in Clearwater County where I want to improve planting for pollinators. I also have a commercial bee farmer with several hundred hives on the property. Are there any plants I should avoid planting? It has been in CRP for about 30 years. I don't want to mess up his honey. That's very considerate.
Considerate. I mean, Jess might want to take this too, but I'll give my initial is that in general, you want to try to stay away from invasive plants or non-native plants for sure. But in terms of native plants that you're going to plant that would be pollinator friendly, I don't think there's really a risk of messing up the honey. I know there are some I don't want to say superstitions, but there are feelings out there that different plants provide different benefits or different quality to the honey. But what I can tell you is, in my experience, we have not yet leashed honeybees. And so they are just roaming around and they are foraging on anything that's in that area. So even when we're saying that honey is, buckwheat honey or clover honey, I guarantee you that that bee was eating some other things because they're out there trying to find a floral resource and consume it and survive, right? So just like us, the more diverse our diet is, arguably the healthier we are. The same is true for wildlife. So the more diversity they can get into their diet, generally the healthier they are. So I think that's awesome. You might want to talk to that landowner and just say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this and I want to be super conscientious about that. So that way you're hearing and listening to their concerns for sure. But my ecologist recommendation is that the more diversity you can get out there, you're going to be helping, not hurting. And Jess, you might have some things you want to
Yeah,
add.
I mean, a lot of times, as Nicole suggested, we consider honeybees to be livestock. And so a lot of times, because they're not native, they forage primarily on non-native plants. And so a lot of times what we hear from honeybee keepers are that they want to plant things like sweet clover, white sweet clover that's not native. And so, feel free to call us back if you want some more information. The Department of Agriculture is usually who we send people to if they have questions about honeybees.
Nice. A different bill, there's a bunch of bills out there, is asking, are you seeing different bees migrating north with climate warming? Are you seeing a shift in species composition that's related to any sort of long trend climate data?
So, as Nicole suggested, this is kind of why we need these data, right? Is that we don't know. In the course of the duration of the bee survey, we certainly collectively, the community of folks doing research on bees, including folks at the university and the bee lab, have documented new species, new non-native species in the state. So they're moving around. Whether or not I can't think of an instance where we've documented a new species to the state that we could pinpoint that it's due to climate change. This baseline list of taxa and of the state will certainly help do that in the future, but at this point it's too early to tell.
Nice, and that's really where the lack of that information is kind of makes it hard to answer that. It's really tough. We got one way at the beginning from Javier that says, I have a garden of mostly tomatoes and peppers in an urban setting. I didn't notice many bees there last year. What can I plant in the garden to attract more bees?
Yeah, so I think I had a bunch of those in my presentation, and I did answer that in the chat. So there's golden Alexander's, yarrow, sunflower, black-eyed Susan, hyssop, purple prairie clover, wild bergamot, gray-headed coneflower. There's a whole list that's in the chat.
Okay.
I would just say feel free to check out some of our native Minnesota seed suppliers. They have tailored packets and lists. There's some great ones that you can find on the DNR's website, our list of native plant suppliers. And
we provided that in the chat. Yep.
Yeah, they know this is a need, and so they're constantly trying to tailor different mixes that are doing the things that we talked about today, that are making sure that you have things that are blooming all season long, that are making sure that there's a grass component, a sedge component, that those guilds are filled. The one thing you'll just want to double check is that sometimes those companies serve a wider area than Minnesota, and so you just want to make sure that the plants that are included in the mix are native to Minnesota and native to your area. And if you're wondering how to do that, you can check out the Minnesota Wildflower website, and they pop up a map and shows you where things are native. You could also check out the DNR's Min-Taxa, but it's a little less user-friendly than Minnesota Wildflower website, so I would recommend that.
Nice.
I would say too that if you're getting tomatoes, the bees are finding it. Tomatoes require pollination for seed set and for fruit set. So a lot of times we don't see them, or we're not noticing quite as much. So I would also recommend just sitting out and watching your tomato plants.
We've got one here. The Sleepy Eye Yes team would like to do a summer community ed program on our prairie restoration plots and Sleepy Eye golf course. Do we need any special permits if we have the participants collect and release pollinators, especially any of the native bees?
I'm putting that to Jess.
I would normally send you to the Fish and Wildlife Service website. So for those that don't know, our state bee is the rusty patch bumblebee, and it is a federally listed species, as Nicole suggested, and it's our most prized possession, and we love it so much, but we can't touch it. It's illegal to handle them, and it's illegal to handle any bumblebees if you're in what the Fish and Wildlife Service call one of their high or low potential zones. Their website is is having a little bit of growing pains at the moment, and so it's really hard to find those maps. But check back with the Fish and Wildlife Service Rusty Patch Bumblebee website in a couple of weeks, and you can see if you're in an area where there might be rusty patch bumblebee, and you shouldn't be handling bumblebees of any kind.
Good information. Good to know. will the events of the Xerxes Society in northeastern Minnesota this summer be posted somewhere specific?
Nicole, you want to take that one?
Yeah, if you are interested, you can send me an email and I'll put you on a wait list. We don't have a specific place that we're going to be posting them yet, and we are not sure how we're going to be advertising them. They'll be limited to about 30 people, so it's going to be pretty small groups. But if you have an interest, shoot me an email and we will get you on a list and keep you posted on what we decide on.
Excellent. And just some other comments. There's some great selection of kits based on what you want to attract help in terms of plantings that are out there. There's some questions in the chat. I'm kind of bouncing up there. Could one of y'all speak to what are some of the other pollinators that are out there in addition to bees? And they specifically reference hummingbirds as being one of them.
Yeah, I kind of touched on this. Yeah, anything that basically visits a flower has a potential to pollinate. They're going to be touching the flower, getting the pollen on them, and then probably visiting other flowers, so they'll be pollinating. Like I said, bees are really the best because they are specifically visiting flowers to collect the pollen. Other insects or birds, small mammals, they're there to either eat the pollen for themselves or drink the nectar. But the bees are there to collect the pollen, and then they'll be leaving that, providing for their young with that pollen that they collect.
Okay. Let me see. Got a question. Is it legal to harvest wild honey?
MDA. They're livestock. I mean, there's certainly since colony collapse disorder in the early 2000s, there certainly was at that time at least a documented decline in feral honeybee hives, and so they're few and far between. That's not to say that there aren't swarms that happen in sometime during the summer or fall that result in feral hives, but would be a question for the Department of Agriculture.
Gotcha. Excellent. Well, we're coming up on the end here. I think I've gotten to a lot, and Megan's been very active in the Q&A and the comments. I want to thank all three of you so much for coming on and talking about this stuff. We had 130 folks on at one point, so it's just great to see the interest. It's great to hear what's going on out there. I will turn it over to y'all for last words, but just thank you very much. It's been really informative. I've learned some stuff, and I hope other folks have too. So, Jess, any last words?
I'm just itching for spring. It feels like it's right around the corner. And James, your description of the bumblebees, turkey hunting, I try to stay away from the turkey hunters too, because I know how it is. So we're often on the lookout. But I'm just so excited to get out there and see some bees this spring.
Yeah. Nicole, anything you wanna say to everybody?
I'm just feeling the same. I'm getting that spring itch here, and I want to go out, and that's my favorite thing to do is just go out and stare at a plant and see how many different insects I can see and find in that one area.
Fantastic. And Megan.
I know it's really spring when my queen bumblebee, yes, mine, she's mine. She's not. She's the people of Minnesota. It's what we don't own wildlife, but she's in my yard, and so I provided this wonderful, beautiful area for her. And so I know it's not the same queen every year. I understand this, but when that queen and her little baby queens emerge, then I know that it's spring, and I'm excited for when the past flowers are up, so that I always get like weirdly anxious where I'm like, do I have flowers? Are they ready? Is it time? Like, I always get nervous about everything syncing up okay. So if you have more questions that we didn't get to answer in the chat, please feel free to reach out to any one of us. We're here to help, and we absolutely love it when you're trying to create spaces and more places for pollinators and other wildlife too. More prairie, yay!
Yeah, that's absolutely more prairie. right, thanks everybody for tuning in. Next week we're going to be talking about rifle cartridge selection. It should be a pretty interesting one if that's what if you're trying to figure out what you're going to use this fall. You know, the birds and the bees folks are thinking spring, and the hunters are already thinking fall. So it's just it's funny how sometimes there's those different timelines. We're gonna sign off here. I'm gonna stop the recording and I'm gonna move us all into the digital green room. But thanks everybody for attending, and have a great day and get out there. The cardinals are singing, the birds are moving around. They're still juncos, so it still means it's winter, but it's coming soon. I promise. I promise it's coming soon. All right. Bye everybody.